that we swapped round and that I left the meeting and tried to come back as Waverley committees and see if it will let me do it.
It seems
Would you
to
like
be
me to do
streaming
that,
now,
Fiona?
Georgina.
Sorry?
I've got a message to say that it is
right.
live.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fiona, are you happy with that? Or Georgina, are you happy now with recording?
It is. It's saying it's recording. Fiona. May we proceed?
Frozen. She's not there.
She is there. She's just muted.
No, you look. She's frozen.
She's frozen. But I would say just for
okay.
I've just checked the YouTube. It is running. So just so everybody knows that when they're talking.
Okay.
Okay, then it is past 8, so we'll start this meeting. If there are any members of the public listening, I do apologise for the slightly late start due to a technical hitch. If I would start off by saying, members, please use the hand raise function within Zoom to indicate that you wish to speak. If you cannot use this, please raise your hand. Please keep yourself on mute when you are not speaking. Please can I also ask that any question you kept brief and to the point. I will call you to speak. Tonight the chat function has been removed to save any... No, we're not removing it, are we yet? No, I take that back. If any members in the meeting lose their connection temporarily, we will pause to allow them time to rejoin the meeting. But if you do leave the meeting for some little while, then I'm afraid you will not be able to vote. Thank you. So, the Standards Committee, if we can go to the agenda, please. Item 1 is the minutes of the last meeting. It took place on the 5th of October. We did in fact take this to full council at the last full council meeting. Can I get agreement to pass those, please, or are there any matters arising? I can't see any hands, so I take that. Is that approved, please?
Approved. Agreed.
Thank you very much. Apologies for absence.
There have been none, Councillor.
Thank you, Georgina. Disclosures of interest, have we had any?
No.
Is there anybody here tonight who wishes to have a disclosure of interest?
No.
I see no hands, thank you very much. Questions by members of the public. Do we have any questions?
None, Councillor.
Thank you. Any questions from members?
None.
Thank you very much.
I do have a question. Hands up.
Sorry?
It's Tom Hughes.
Councillor Tom Hughes.
I can wait until we discuss the specific items on the agenda, but I do have 2 small questions when we go to the first item on the agenda, which is the review of arrangements for dealing with standards, item 6. Okay, just so you know.
Thanks, Councillor. Right, in fact, we'll move on to item 6, which is the monitoring of some matters. Robin, are you going to introduce this?
Yes, Chairman, thank you very much. So this report puts forward a number of proposed changes to the Council's arrangements as set out within our Constitution for dealing with complaints submitted to me as monitoring officer about alleged breaches of the Code of Conduct. As a reminder, these arrangements apply to any complaints about the conduct of a borough, town or parish councillor within the Waverley area. The County Council would deal with any complaints about the conduct of county councillors. So the report seeks to achieve a handful of things. The first is to bring the arrangements up to date with best practice. Secondly, it's intended to learn from the experience of applying the current set of arrangements, so my own experience and others involved. And finally, to provide a summary at the top of the document of the various stages of the process as a summary, so that anyone involved in the process can easily see where they are within it. Paragraph 4.5 of the report sets out the main changes, but every proposed change is marked as a track change within the body of the document. Subject to your views today as a committee, it may be sensible for me to consult on these proposed changes a little more widely before they go forward to full council, but I'll leave that with you to advise me. Specifically, the proposals do have implications for the independent person and the town and parish councils and clerks, so they may have a view that we want to hear, but I wanted to hear your view first as a committee. There are 3 typos within the report I want to draw attention to. The first is at paragraph 3, where the sentence should say, to ensure the council's arrangements for handling standards allegations reflect best practice. So I'm sorry that those words fell off the page, they were there in the original draft. The second is paragraph 4.5 little 7, which should say without, not with. And that's obviously an important clarification. On page 13 in row 6, where the text says evidence of a code, that should say evidence of a code breach. So I just wanted to draw your attention to those typos before we begin. Happy to pick up any others as we go, although obviously what I'm mainly interested in, and the chairman will be too, is your views on the substance of the proposals. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. So let's begin with questions. Councillor Hughes, you've indicated you wanted to ask a question on this. I have assumed that everybody's read these papers. So Councillor Hughes, would you like to ask your questions?
Yeah, I have 2 questions. First of all, I think the substance of the document is good and clear, and the track changes are very good to see where you can focus on. My 2 points refer to page 18, section 4.4, section G. So if I just go to that section, sorry, I'm on 2 screens at the moment. It mentions within there that if a complaint is more than 2 months old, that it would be deemed as invalid. I think that is too short a period, personally. And I think most complaints I've seen in my business life, really, some of them don't have a sort of statute of limitations on it. And some of them, the minimum is normally around 6 months. So could you give me some enlightenment why 2 months was selected as a reasonable amount of time before which a complaint would be invalidated?
Robin, I think you answered that this morning. Could you tell the committee, please?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hughes. So, I mean, it's really put forward as a first stab for discussion. At the moment, we don't have any time limit. At the moment, as you can see, the arrangements just refer to something being so long ago, there will be little benefits taking action now. In putting forward 2 months, it's what simply seemed reasonable to me. And when I was putting that forward, I was thinking about, firstly, how things can deteriorate in the memory if we leave them too long. But secondly, how long is fair for the councillor who's having an allegation against them? How long a length of time is fair for that councillor to wait and then have something brought up that was done more than 2 months ago? But it was my first attempt at a time period, and I'm very happy to hear alternative views. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. If we remain on this question, is there anybody else that wishes to comment on those 2 months? Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I have some sympathy with that point. In my outside role as well, I also adjudicate complaints of this sort of nature, and as much as I agree that an unlimited period is probably undesirable for the reasons you've outlined, and I do think 6 months is probably also too long. I also do think that 2 months is too short. I would suggest that we make that at least 3 or 4, so it's at least, one quarter of the year. For me, 3 months would be sufficient, just as a balance between those two. I think you're quite right to bring in some form of limit, because actually one of the things we do as a committee need to remember is to take into account the people being accused as much as those doing the accusing, and as you say, an unlimited period does cause issues. So I would request 3 months as a start for 10 rather than 2, but would oppose 6. Thank you, Chair.
Is there any other councillor who wishes to make a comment on that? I think I would agree with Councillor Follows on 3 months. As you said, Robert, it is a stab. What we have to do is have a balance, isn't it, between actually getting on with it, but at the same time letting things lie. And I would have thought 3 months is a sensible area. Councillor Hyman, did you wish to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I don't think there should necessarily really be a set limit, a short-term set limit of 2, 3, or even 6 months necessarily, because very often you find a situation where, for instance, if the council is acting in a certain way because of a legal interpretation or whatever, and if that interpretation has been challenged for a long time, not through the courts, but has been challenged in the chamber, or questioned in the chamber, and then a legal judgment comes out which proves a position to be correct, or confirms that a previous judgment should be interpreted in a certain way, then there are always situations where an injustice could occur if something cannot be corrected. It's a matter of rectifying mistakes, isn't it? Standards is all about when people make mistakes, whether it be deliberate or accidental, that those mistakes aren't repeated, that we've got a system that makes sure that deliberate mistakes are certainly not repeated, and people are held accountable for them. But we certainly want to make sure that if things go wrong, then we have a system which allows mistakes to be rectified. So I think we do have to remain flexible, and I think that was probably the reason why we didn't have a time limitation in the first place. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Councillor Goodrich.
Chairman, I think we've got to remember that this procedure is for alleged breaches of code of conduct. And the example given by Councillor Hyman, with the greatest respect, is not covered. I mean, we are dealing with breaches of code of conduct where councillors have breached, allegedly, those code of conduct. And I think it's something which, if you leave it, I'm happy with Councillor Follow's suggestion that we should make it 3 months. I don't feel strongly about it. But I think the problem of making a complaint by an individual against a councillor is that it's unfair on the councillor to have the thing sprung upon him or her if too much time has passed, because you can't recollect what happened, you haven't got the paperwork maybe of what happened. And I think therefore a relatively short period of time, I mean, if there's been a breach of conduct, there's been alleged breach of conduct, there's been alleged breach, and you should, as soon as you know about it or feel that it's been breached, you should make a complaint or shut up. You can't leave it hanging in the air for an indefinite period. It's unfair on the councillor concerned. I have something else to say about other parts, but that's what I want to say about that particular subject. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. Is there anybody else who wishes to say anything? Robin, do you want us to take a vote on that? Oh, sorry, Councillor Gray's put his hand up now.
Yeah, and I think Councillor Adams also now has his hand up. Just to point on that, although 2 or 3 months may not be an issue, I think we have to look at this in the round, because the whole process may take 6 months to actually go through and to go through a hearing and everything else. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that a councillor who's got a complaint about another councillor or a code of conduct issue should not be brought before the monitoring officer within a period of 8 to 9 weeks, which is what 2 months would be. It may not necessarily be the end of it. He may raise the issue, may raise the complaint, and the monitoring officer may go back for clarification. So it may be 3 months before we start this process. So I'd be very, very reluctant to move it from 2 months. I certainly wouldn't vote against 3, but my recommendation would be to keep it at 2 months, and that being reasonable in my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor Adams, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Chairman. I agree with Councillor Gray, to be honest. I mean, we're only talking about the start of the complaint, aren't we here? We're not talking about the whole process. So, I mean, if somebody feels that things have gone wrong, then it's quite reasonable for them to make the complaint within 2 months. I agree also the problem is, I mean, lots of people don't actually keep papers from meetings and things over longer than, 2 months at the most. So, it's very difficult to go back and see what was actually said. I mean, admittedly, okay, a lot of it's is stored on the webcam and everything. But even so, I mean, I think, if somebody suddenly thinks, oh gosh, 2 months ago, oh God, yeah, I was insulted, I should raise a complaint. I mean, that's quite long enough, really, to keep anything open. I'm also not quite sure why, which is slightly different, but again on 4.4 on page 18, we're crossed out that complaints which are submitted anonymously have been crossed out. That seems to be quite reasonable, that everybody should see, well, not everybody, but the monitoring officer anyway, should see who's made the complaint rather than it just coming in anonymously.
Thank you, Councillor Adams. Before Councillor Follows come back, anybody else? No. Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me come back. The reason I would argue 3 as opposed to 2 is because, certainly in my outside hat, there is often a case where an individual who might be wanting to make a complaint needs to, in some cases, have the courage and the time to process that through in order to feel that they can do that. Now, in most cases, I would hope that such a member would engage informally with the monitoring officer in order to talk about their issue and to talk about the process up to and including then making a complaint. That would, I'm sure, be the ideal scenario. But I think in this case, having 3 months allows even the most reticent member to sort of process their thoughts on the subject. Oh, sorry, someone's. Hello? I'm seemingly getting myself back. Anyway, that's why I'm arguing 3 months, because it's a reasonable amount of time for somebody who is reticent to process it, but not so much that it is an unreasonable burden on a potential victim to have somebody 6 months down the line go, well, here's an issue. You insulted me 6 months ago and I've now finally decided to raise it. I think it's a reasonable balance between the two. And that's why it needs to have a time period, but also not an excessive one. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Councillor Hyman, you wanted to come back?
Well, yes. Firstly, Chairman, that Councillor Goodridge's claim that what I was referring to was irrelevant is completely wrong. It's entirely relevant. I've got a lot of experience of this standard system, and I had a complaint against me which was many, many months old, and that would have been outlawed by this. But you know, we have to look at the. For instance, if I ask a question at a council meeting, or if a member of the public asks a question at a council meeting, doesn't get a response and that they are satisfied with, and then asks that to be told, is told that they will have a response in writing because they were given it verbally at the meeting, and then asked that they to find out who it was that was going to be held accountable for it, who was accountable for the response that was given by the mayor or whoever, the chairman at the meeting. If that isn't sent through, a lot of time can go by before the person knows. I mean, how long do you give someone to send you a written response? And then if you receive that written response, if you're going to make a complaint, you obviously don't wish to make a complaint against the chairman or the mayor because somebody else has written the response for them. But your only way to complain very often in such a situation is if you make a complaint against the person and they in effect are passing that complaint on. Because if no one's taking accountability, and this is all about accountability, the whole thing is about, as it says at the top of page 20, Chairman, it's about facilitating transparency and ethical governance accountability. And accountability is what it's all about. So I really think that to have a limitation where you have at least 2 months between council meetings, if the person wants to come back and then ask the questions or say, you know, I didn't get an answer last time, well, more than 2 months is up already. So if someone doesn't want to go into the standard system because they consider it a waste of public money or potentially a waste of public money, if they can just get an apology or an answer, you know, we really don't want to be forcing people to have to take things to the standards committee or to the standards panel or to the monitoring officer if it's possible for them to get another a resolution without going through something which will cost money. And I think that one of the reasons for not having a time limit is it's going to cost us more money with a lot more complaints if there's a time limit placed on it, because you can't come to a reasonable conclusion within a couple of months and you're being forced into making a written, which nobody really wants to do, frankly, as far as I know. You know, it's not the sort of thing you want to make a complaint against another member unless you've got a political reason for doing so.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hyman. I can't see any more hands. In that
would
case,
like
we
to-
seem to have Councillor Marriott. Peter Marriott, that is.
Thank you, Chair. I'll go first. Penny has something to say as well. But there's a small typo on page 25, section 11.1. I think the second line there should be co-opted member, not co-opted councillor. Thank you.
Yes, can we just deal with this item first on the 2-3 months or through? We seem to make one of three. Either we go for 2 months, 3 months, or no limit. Can I have a show of hands, please, for those in favour of 2 months?
Sorry to interrupt, but can I just let you know that Councillor Hughes and Councillor Adams both have their Zoom hands raised.
Sorry, I don't. I know, I can see those another way. Sorry, who are the Councillor Hughes? You had the other
Councillor
question.
Hughes and Councillor Adams.
Councillor
and
Adams.
Penny Marriott.
They're all coming back. Councillor Marriott, you haven't spoken yet. Councillor Marriott.
Penny Marriott, you need to unmute.
Yeah. Hi. I wasn't going to speak on the time, so I thought I need to speak on something about typos further on. So if you could leave it for now.
Yes, please. Councillor Adams, is this on the time?
Well, I was just going to ask, are you dealing with all questions on this section, or are we just dealing with the time and you're coming back to ask for other issues?
I just want to deal with the timing element, because
Okay.
we've got three choices, haven't we?
Yeah.
2 months, 3 months, or unlimited. Okay. Councillor Hughes, did you want to come back on the timing?
Yes, very briefly. I acted as an independent person in my own company, and one of the most difficult things in standards is bullying and harassment. Because if somebody makes an allegation, then people who have been too scared to do it in the past will then join in that allegation because they feel more confident in the situation. If you have 2 months as a limit, would that invalidate other people joining in an issue with a councillor which they'd kept secret and quiet in the past? So it's just something to be aware of. And, you know, I agree there's 3 votes that you have and 3 ways to proceed with this. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I can't see. Robin, did you want to come in? I see your hand raised.
Can I just clarify a couple of things? I mean, the first thing is that when we're talking about 2 months, and I think the wording around that point G could be improved, actually. I think we're talking about 2 months since the date of the alleged incident. So it really is just 2 months between whatever happening and the complaint being submitted. So just to clarify that, because there were some references to counting that 2 months in various other ways. So I hope that clarifies. There were other points that were being raised, but I think you're just on this timing question at the moment, Councillor.
Thank you, Robin. In that case, I will ask for a vote, please. First of all those in favour of, as we've got the recommendation of 2 months, can I see raised hands, please? Georgina, are you noting it?
At the moment, we've got 2 people with their hands up.
Thank you. Can I have those then for 3 months?
Chairman, are we going to get a 6 months option?
How many have we got there, Georgina?
Some of the people who are voting aren't on the committee.
I can only, yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the committee plus Councillor Follows.
Sorry, Georgina, I am a member of this committee.
Are you?
Councillor Follows is a member.
I absolutely am, Georgina. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'm really sorry, Councillor Follows.
Have you now
I'm
got
sorry,
the,
Chairman, if we're talking about standards and doing things properly, can we know what the options are before we?
yes,
Because
I
are we being told we've got a choice of just 2 or 3 months, and if you have a different view, forget about it? Is that the case? I would
Councillor
be happy
Hyman,
with that.
Councillor Hyman, it was proposed that we had 2 months, 3 months, or an unlimited. I will take a vote on 6 months if you wish to put it forward. I have no problem, it's not in there. So at the moment, it would seem 3 months. All those in favour of 6 months, then raise your hand, please.
You can't really count the votes until you know what the motion is, Chairman, because there will be people who have already voted who didn't know what the motion was or what all the options were. I think the monitoring officer should comment upon that.
I did say at the beginning. I did say at the beginning 2 months, 3 months, or unlimited. That seemed to be the questions.
It's up, Councillor Hyman, it's up to the chairman, because these aren't formal recommendations within the paper. The chairman, as I understand it, is just doing an informal vote here to see which way the committee is heading. So, you know, the recommendations aren't specifically about this point, they're about the entirety of the changes. So I think the chairman's just trying to find a way through and see how people wish to, what you want to propose.
Absolutely, it is an alteration within the document. Can I take a vote then on all those in favour of unlimited time, as it used to be?
We've got one councillor.
Well, if it's not
Thank
6
you.
months,
Oh, two.
Councillor Hyman.
well, if there's an option of unlimited time against 1 or 2 months, 2 or 3 months, then I will go unlimited. If there's an option of 6 months or a year, then I would consider those 2 options. But I didn't know that we'd had a recommendation put in front of us. I'd like this to be done rather more formally than it is being done, with a recommendation and a seconder or whatever. At least done so we know what we're voting on and what the options are. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. I think it's quite clear, and the majority of people have been going for 3 months. So can I take it that all those in favour of accepting 3 months, please? Georgina, is that a majority?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 5.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll alter the document to 3 months then. Thank you. Moving on, back to questions on the whole document. So can I see raised hands, please, for any more questions? I think, Councillor Hughes, you had a second question.
Yeah, and this might be just my reading of the situation. So under page 25, section 11, which explains the independent person, in one, at the start of that section, it says that the Waverley Council will appoint 3 independent persons who are councillors. And then on the next paragraph, it says you cannot be an independent person if you are a councillor. It just seemed, maybe I misread it incorrectly, but it seemed like it was confusing. So that's page 25, section 11. Did I misread that? Or am I not understanding
The independent
Sorry.
person is not a councillor. The independent person cannot be a councillor, or a councillor cannot be an independent person.
But doesn't the first sentence say Waverley will appoint 3 independent people who are councillors?
I know what's happened there, so that's my apologies. One of the changes I've done is a find and replace on all of the references to member and changed it to councillor. And clearly a member of the community is quite different in that reading. So that should not have been changed. That should still say members of the community rather than councillors of the community.
Oh, it shows you I read the document then.
Thank you. So that's a helpful change. Thank you.
I like
Thank you for that. We missed that one this morning when we went through it. Thank you. Councillor Marriott, you've been waiting ages. You're muted.
Yes, no, I'm all right now, am I?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. There were a number of things on that page. I think that page 18, 4.4a, which I think it's A, because the B has been crossed out. It says complaints which do not identify a subject and then councillor.
That's the same issue, Chairman. So
Yeah.
quite correct.
Okay. Then on page 24, no, on page 20 something. Hang on a moment. Oh, yes. Page 22. There seem to be two headings here which have the same title, and they're not the same. So it's 6. What happens if the investigation officer concludes there is no evidence? That's number 7 as well. What happens if the investigator concludes there is no evidence? There is evidence. Oh, right. Okay. Yes, I misread it. My fault. Yes, but it's yes. Sorry, I misread it. Yes. Okay, that's
Have you another one, or?
No, that's fine.
Thank you very much. I now have Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Chairman. A couple of points. Firstly, a quick one on page 25. There is reference to the chairman at the very top line of page 25. And then the next paragraph, it's referred to as the chairman of the hearings panel. It seems to me we should be consistent and just say chairman in both cases. Or when it comes to page 14 and going over to 15, which is the panel hearing, I understood from the Constitution that if there is a complaint against a town or parish councillor, that the panel will still consist of 3, 2 Waverley councillors and 1 of our parish or town councillors on this committee, and that all 3 would have voting rights, where we seem to now be saying, and I think we may have got it wrong in the previous version, that we're now saying that the panel will still consist of 3, with the parish or town councillor being tagged on without any voting rights. I think we need to be consistent with this document and the rest of the Constitution, and I would welcome any comments from Robin Taylor in that regard.
Robin, are you content with that voting right?
Chairman, I'm content that with the proposal from Councillor Goodridge, because I think he's correct that the Constitution does refer to that elsewhere. So when this goes forward to full council, I think we need to make sure that the 2, because actually this document forms part of the Constitution, so it's just really making sure that all parts of the Constitution align on that.
Thank you. Have you finished, Councillor Goodridge?
Yeah, there's one minor. All right. There's one minor typo, but I can do it separately. But there was an "an" instead of an "any" on page bottom of page 20. The 3 lines or 3 lines up. Monitoring officer considers that "an" form. It should be "any" form. Or "and some" form, and that wording needs to be just tidied up.
Thank you. We go on to Councillor Peter Marriott.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I brought the topic out of order earlier on, and I think that's since been covered anyway by Councillor Mowes. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brian Adams. You're muted, Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. I have 3. One quick question, which is on page 18, 4.4, the first item, and that is, why are we crossed out that complaints submitted anonymously would be invalid? Surely they would be naturally invalid if they're anonymous. So that's the first question. The second question is, in respect of 5.3 on page 22, should there not be some time limit indicated on that also for the first evidence of timings coming back, of investigation findings coming back? Because it seems that after we've allowed just 3 months now for the complaint, after that it just seems to float into oblivion. And then the other point was in 8.7 on page 24. If a councillor can't actually be be disqualified, isn't it it seems unreasonable that he's not actually able to access any of the information, especially at this point, under the current circumstances where everything is electronic. If you would completely cut him off from any form of communication.
Robin, can you answer those three, please?
Yep. Thank you, Chairman. So firstly, on the point about anonymous complaints, there's a distinction here between complaints which are actually anonymous, which means I don't know who submitted them to me, and complaints which aren't anonymous to me, but where the complainant puts forward a case for their identity to be withheld, either from the subject member or from anybody else. So, subject to the views here, my proposal is that anonymous complaints, really anonymous complaints, shouldn't be accepted, whereas there could be a case put forward for withholding the identity of a complainant. So that's the first point. In terms of the investigation findings, I did give consideration, Councillor Adams, to putting more definitive timescales on that. It is very difficult because it does depend almost entirely on the type of complaint, how much detail there is involved, the external investigator, and to some degree the availability of all the parties involved to play their part in the process. So I would find it difficult to put timescales against that, but happy to hear your views. In terms of 8.7 around withdrawing facilities provided to the councillor, I mean, I think you're absolutely correct. This provision is in there to deal with very specific cases where most likely where that councillor has abused the access to IT or equipment that's been given to them. So that's not the sort of case that I've encountered, but could do. Nationally, we have had cases where councillors have abused the IT or the facilities that have been given to them. And there could be cases where it would be appropriate to remove that IT, but clearly that would be a fairly extreme case. I would advise against scrubbing it out of the arrangements, though.
Councillor Adams, are you happy now?
Yes, I would agree entirely with Robin's answer to the first point. The second point, I think there should be some form of report back to everybody concerned if there is going to be a significant delay in the actual decision-making process somehow. I mean, just so that otherwise, as I say, it just drifts into space and nobody really knows what's going on. And on the third point, then I would think that's fine, but I think exceptions should be made at the monitoring officer's discretion, even if that is decided to be enacted, so that the councillor can actually communicate with some people in the council.
Robin, did you want to come back on that?
No, Chairman, not unless you want me to come back on a specific.
No, it's okay. Is there anybody else got a view on that question from Councillor Adams? Councillor Follows.
So just on the general subject of anonymity, if I may, Chair, if that's all right.
Yes,
While we're on this particular subject. So obviously, and I apologise if I don't articulate this particularly well, because I'm just still trying to form the question sort of in my head as well. So obviously you've got effectively through sections 4.7 through to 4.9, you're articulating the right of a complainant to anonymity for various reasons. On the balance of that, is there a right of somebody who is complained about to request the rationale for your decision to grant anonymity? And I think I can't see that in the document, but it would seem to me that if there is a right to establish anonymity, there should also be a right of a complainant to understand why anonymity has been granted, if that makes sense. And I think the document would benefit from having that right established too. The only other thing I would say is that obviously, if I can, the most politic way I can put this is that clearly there is a lot of learning that has happened over the last 6 months, particularly because obviously there's been an increased burden upon the monitoring officer role in terms of cases. And obviously a lot of that learning is clearly in this document, and it's good to see quite so much of that getting into the document. I think that's great. Obviously, I mean, I've been dealing around the edges with the subject of anonymity. So I think it would be good if we've established a responsibility and a right on one side for the complainant to balance it out for the person who's being complained about. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, Robin, did you want to come on that point?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I mean, firstly, just to clarify, the text that was removed that Councillor Adams was referring to earlier was one of a list of examples of things where complaints would be invalid. So previously the arrangement said anonymous complaints are invalid. So what I'm saying, what I've actually done in the proposals here is to take out that automatic invalidity and have made it something where I would only accept an anonymous complaint after consulting with the independent person. So you see that right at the top of the document at page 11, that I would have to consult the independent person either before accepting an anonymous complaint or before agreeing to withhold someone's identity. So I hope that's clear. And the second point is, in terms of Councillor Follow's question, I think there does have to be judgment there. I would always want to convey to the subject member the reason why an anonymity had been granted, if you like. There's some terminology confusion here. Clearly that will depend on the reason why it has been granted. And it may be that it has to be an edited or paraphrased version that goes to the subject member, depending on the reason why that anonymity has been granted in the first place. So I would be a little bit wary about codifying that within these arrangements, because there's so many different scenarios that one can imagine. So, but the principle, I agree with you, Councillor Follows, you know, to be open with all parties, but there could be occasions where the full reason had to stay with me.
Apologies, Chair. May I come back on that briefly?
You may come back on that specific, yes.
Thank you. So firstly, I am slightly worried that could lead to a complaint, somebody who's being complained about feeling that they are unable to understand the reasons why the anonymity has been granted. Now, I entirely accept the difference between an anonymous complaint and one to which you have granted anonymity. There's absolutely a difference there, material difference, and I respect that. But I do think there should be a codified right of somebody who has been complained against, where the party has been granted anonymity, that requests either that you give some form of explanation or that it goes out to a. I mean, what I'm trying to say is I just think there should be a right of challenge here. I mean, otherwise people will just try and file anonymous complaints. And I know you have to go through a process to establish that, but it does feel like that the person who's being complained about here should have a right to challenge your determination on the subject.
I would accept that we need transparency here. It doesn't seem quite as though they have a transparent answer. Robin, have you anything else to say?
Only to say that the purpose of putting in the provision of asking the independent person is so that they could challenge me on whether or not I should withhold that identity. One of the most useful things the independent person can do is to challenge my thinking in this process. So I agree with the point about challenge. Maybe we should put something in here which refers to the fact that the monitoring officer would, you know, give an explanation to the subject member as to why anonymity has been granted, but I would need to edit that accordingly.
Councillor Follows?
Yeah, sorry, I'd be very happy to have. I think that's actually all that is really needed. The person who's being complained about, if anonymity has been granted, that the monitoring officer will do their best to explain why that's been granted, without obviously breaking that anonymity in the first place. I mean, because otherwise somebody's just, you know, told, well, an anonymous complaint's been put in about you. Monitoring officer says it's fine that it's anonymous, and that's all you're told. I can imagine that would be quite a stressful position for the person being complained about, and I think mandating some limited form of explanation as much as is possible would be a reasonable balance.
Thank you. Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of points. First of all, the summary that's on pages 11 to 14, is it intended that basically goes into the Constitution in some way? and I'll give you all of them so that they can come back on that. The reason being that there are, it's quite difficult to refer that to the Constitution in places, but the steps are particularly useful going through to be able to read the full Constitution. On page 17, you have a date in there, which is 28 days, where a complaint concerns two borough councillors. The monitoring officer will initially refer the matter to the appropriate group leaders for them to resolve it if possible. But that says 28 days will be allowed for that. And if you go back to page 13, point 6, it says where the informal approach is to be taken, monitoring officer will aim to resolve the issues of your complaint within 30 working days. I just think we perhaps need to check some of these timings to make sure that we aren't overlapping. I'm not sure they're all consecutive. And the other point on timing is, I think that it starts off very well by talking about 5 days, 10 days, 25 days, 30 days, but it could then go on for 6 months and there's no need for a feedback. And I do think that there should be, and I think Councillor Follows raised it, I think there should be a need for a feedback after 3 months and then monthly, or maybe it's 4 months and monthly, but I do think there needs to be some form of follow-up on that. The last point is you talked about anonymous. Anonymous, completely anonymous rather than anonymity. Oops, I can't even say that tonight. Anonymous coming through to the monitoring officer. If it actually refers to an instance, I think it's very difficult just to ignore it completely. It's not that dissimilar to whistleblowing and other approaches there. And it's a good indication that something is wrong. I don't think we could just out of hand remove those. Thank you. They're my 3 points.
Robin, did you want to come back and answer any of those?
I mean, on the final one, Chairman, just to clarify again that what I'm proposing in these arrangements is that we don't dismiss anonymous complaints out of hand, but that I would consult with the independent person before deciding whether or not to accept them.
Are you happy on the timings as laid out in the report? Robin, are you happy?
Well, I'm happy. I will double check the point about making sure there are no overlapping times.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I could come back, does that mean that the head of policy and governance doesn't want to be held accountable for any form of update post the first 2 or 3 months?
Would you like me to answer that?
Robin, yes.
Okay. No, we obviously the aim is always to communicate throughout the process, but I would suggest that if you start putting in, we'll communicate at this point, at that point, and the other point, it will depend on the case. So the aim is to be communicative throughout.
Thank you. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I thought that normally when we do changes to the Constitution, we would go through each and every change of wording that's being proposed and look at the justification for it. Sometimes it's obvious and you don't need to waste time on it, but I would have thought that we would go through them, and I'd assumed we would go through them, each of them, and look at what the changes are and how it has been improved because of it, and why it's been improved, why the change is necessary. And I'm a little bit lost because people seem to have been dotting around backwards and forwards throughout the documents, and there doesn't seem to be any sort of method in our madness at the moment. I am concerned about the way we're doing this, so I'm going to assume that we are now on the whole document and that we can address that, can we? Because we started with the questions and you asked us to specifically address those. Are we still addressing individual questions and dotting around, or are we addressing the document as a whole and going to go through it? Because
the answer is, I have relied on you to have read the document, and
I
what I'm
have read
asking
the
is for
document.
questions. Yeah, I know you have. What I'm saying is I'm asking everybody on the committee I've trusted them all to read the document. Therefore, I'm asking for questions that they see in the document they want to raise, which is what is happening at the moment. Have you a specific question?
Well, this is, yeah, absolutely. I've actually got a motion or a recommendation, I think, because I'm probably going to have to do that at some point in here, because this is a serious, very serious subject. Reputations can hang upon what decisions that are made by members judging other members here. Possibly, you know, people's reputations can be irreparably damaged, potentially, if poor processes allow injustices to occur. And it's our role here to make sure that doesn't happen, Chairman. I think, you know, really it's down to, unless there is an assurance of the truth and accountability in the system from the very beginning, then there's not going to be any justice. And this is the problem we've got with the system at the moment. It's vital public perception must see a fair system where justice is seen to be done and where any injustices are rectified. And we don't have anything in this document at the moment to ensure that. I mean, there are difficulties. We have to recognise this. We're in an arena which is adversarial. It is confrontational. There are inherent difficulties in the political world and in public service, mainly from the difficulty people have in admitting mistakes. There's a simple way through this system which says, and the monitoring officer has explained it very well in here, that you know, the easy way of doing something is to talk it over, just discuss it informally, and if the member can then admit to and make an apology, then the thing can be sorted. But that's incredibly difficult for people to do in a political world. And if you are in the right, you're certainly not going to take that informal measure, because you're not going to admit, as I didn't, and it took 2 years for to go through my hearing. 2 years, because I could not get an answer to a straight question, and I was not going to admit to something which the courts had found I was right about. So, you know, this is very, very difficult subject for me to get across to you where we've got the problems in the system, Chairman. And it says people have been taught. I haven't been asked about this. It's had none of the feedback. There's no feedback in here from my experiences of this. So, you know, we've got to get round the problem. We all remember the Paxman interview with a minister who couldn't answer the question, and it made him look exceedingly bad, as Paxman kept asking the question, couldn't get an answer. You know, if we're going to not do that sort of thing at Waverley and not put people in a position where they're having to ask the same question over and over again but not get an answer, which is where complaints come from, we're never going to achieve the ethical governance accountability from the top of page 20, it's 4.9a that we're aiming for, unless we've got a system, it's our own judicial system effectively, of people judging other people. We have to have a system where we are pledging to tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and that's all the parties involved in the particular issue, and we don't have that. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, it's very simple. The corporate code of conduct, the code of conduct, the whole standard system is based on the Nolan principles. They're on page 54 of the committee papers today and under a later item. And the last but one simply tells us this is under honesty that we have to be truthful. We have to have a system that ensures from the very start that you can get to the truth so that we don't waste our time. For that reason, the system must incorporate a simple method of ensuring the veracity of statements that are made, the truth of a person's position before the system even starts, before the complaint system even starts. We have to have that there. Otherwise, we don't have a judicial system. It's a kangaroo court. All right. So we've got to be able to ascertain without wasting time and public money that the position that the complainant is taking is truthful, and the position that the advice that people are receiving and that the independent person is receiving is truthful, and obviously the person who is being complained about needs to answer questions truthfully. So what I'd like to recommend, put as a motion, is that we include in this, as a bare minimum, the rights to obtain a clear answer to a question in writing in good time. And that would have to be from the chief executive or from the monitoring officer, whichever is ultimately responsible for the system. Because if you can't get an answer to a simple question, then the system doesn't work. It never is going to work. As I say, if there is no assurance of truth, if there is no accountability, if anyone is above the law, there's no justice, Chairman. Yeah, you do want to interrupt, I know. But as far as I'm concerned, that must work both ways. But there must be a right to obtain a clear answer to a question in writing in good time. It's got to be in our constitution. It must work for this system and for throughout the whole system. Otherwise, the whole basis of our system, which is the Nolan principles, where we've got to be truthful, it can be bypassed completely by anyone. If we want accountability, that's got to be in there. So I want to know which of the other members of the committee want to ensure that we have to be truthful by putting in there the right to obtain a clear answer. It must apply to officers, to everyone. It must work all ways. We must have the right to obtain a clear answer.
You've made your point, Councillor Hyman. Thank you.
Will you recommend that now, and can we have a vote on it then, please, Chairman? It's not a matter of making a point, Chairman. It's a matter of whether or not we're going to have that in here or not, as far as I'm concerned, because I know the problems with the system we've got. I've been through it.
Chair, I don't. Yeah, thank you. I do just want to very briefly reply to Councillor Hyman. First off, there is always going to be a difficulty in establishing objective truth in some cases, especially as you freely admit, there is often a political element to what we're discussing. As much as I would love to be able to objectively verify the truth of any subject, it is often not possible. I think what this system does do, though, is allow both parties involved in a complaint to establish, and in fact, it compels the monitoring officer to do so with an independent person and independent investigator if necessary, to establish the facts of a matter. The establishment of the truth is a different thing entirely in some cases, but the facts are established. Now, as a group leader and as somebody who often is involved with many of the other people of my political persuasion across Waverley, and even myself here, I have also been through this entire process end to end. And that has involved a full collection of the facts on both sides. It has involved the consultation with independent persons, as described here. It has involved an independent investigator who has established the facts on both sides as well, and presented all the opportunities for both parties to present their version of the truth, because it is always a version of the truth when it's the opinion of a person. I think what you're talking about in terms of the almost an SLA in terms of, or a KPIs and getting a response from certain officers. Firstly, I don't think you will ever get what you want if your question is, there needs in 10 days time, the chief exec needs to give me the answer I want. He'll give you an answer, but I don't necessarily think he's always going to give you the answer you want, which is possibly the issue.
Point of personal explanation, Chairman. But Chairman, I'm not saying anything like that.
Okay, Councillor Hyman.
I'm sorry.
Then, Councillor Hyman, I apologise if I've misrepresented your words. I think I'll just very quickly finish by saying I think it's probably at this point, with the chair's consent, that Daniel Bainbridge probably explained what the process for officers replying to members is.
Yes, I've just seen Daniel's hand go up. Daniel, would you like to interpret this?
My hand was up, not really on that point. It's just more the purpose of the local arrangements, the item that we're on. When the statutory basis for those Localism Act is that the authority needs to have in place a set of arrangements that govern the dealing with of standards or complaints regarding the conduct of councillors, both Waverley and parish and town. I think Councillor Hyman's point is one that he can take forward, but it's not really for these arrangements to deal with, and nor really is it for the code of conduct to deal with as well. But it's a separate matter if Councillor Hyman wants to see something like that in the constitution or wherever it might be. But it's not something that should fall within these arrangements. That's not the purpose of this document, and it's not the purpose of the code of conduct either, I'm afraid, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Point of order, Chairman. This document says it's about ensuring ethical governance and accountability. And if we're not going to have any way of doing that, this document isn't about that. So, if you cannot ensure that there is accountability, if we can judge somebody and say that person has done wrong, and then it turns out that actually we were being political, we were being unfair, that person turned out to be correct about something because the truth never came out in the first place, right? And this is the situation we've been through. Then you know, how can the system possibly work if you are holding a person to account, but the people making the decision are totally unaccountable? That system doesn't work, does it? It can't work.
There is, as you know, an appeal system in here as well as built in, which should also help with safeguarding.
We can talk about
Robin,
that as well. Should we go through the document from the page by page?
One moment, Councillor Hyman. Robin, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I think Daniel's covered it. The points, Councillor Hyman, that you're making, it's not that whether they're correct or incorrect, but a lot of this wouldn't be part of these arrangements. These arrangements are the process that I should follow as monitoring officer when I receive a complaint about alleged misconduct by a councillor. There are many other parts of the Constitution. This is part of the Constitution, but there are many other parts of the Constitution which cover how councillors may ask questions and responding to councillors, access to information, etc., etc. And as the chairman's just said, there are elements of these arrangements which do ensure that every party involved gets the chance to have their say. The complainant gets a chance to put their perspective forward, and the councillor being complained about gets the opportunity to put their perspective forward. And it's my job to consider both of those perspectives and the perspective of the independent person where that's appropriate before making any sort of judgment. So I hope that provides a general statement of reassurance.
Thank you.
Can my motion be heard, please? Can my motion be heard?
Councillor Goodwin.
Chairman, can my motion please be heard? As a point of order, I have a right to move that we insert into here the right to obtain a clear answer to a question in writing in good time, and that we can reach common ground, do the job properly. We have to be able to do this properly, or we do not have a system that works. We are talking about having a system that works. And it's easy for anyone to turn around and say, oh no, we don't want that to be part of it. But I'm sure I'm probably not the only councillor who would like the system to be based on truth and fact. And so I'd just like to find out, so that the public at home know, which members want it to be based on truth and fact. So
point of order, Councillor Hyman, I resent, point of order, and I resent Councillor Hyman presenting firstly the views of other members that haven't been established, and secondly that by not supporting his version of this motion that we are in some way against truth and fact being presented. I completely resent that, and I would like to withdraw it.
Let residents decide. We're in a public meeting.
Councillor Hyman, I will get you muted. Please let other people have a chance to speak. You had your chance. Thank you.
Motion, I have a right to put a motion to you and it be voted, don't I?
Just one moment. Right, Daniel, can I come to you, please, for advice on what Councillor Hyman is proposing?
Well, I think Robin and I agree on this. That the, as I said before, it's not that we disagree with what Councillor Hyman is suggesting. It's that the sort of process that Councillor Hyman is talking about is not appropriate for these two documents, be it the local arrangements or the code of conduct which is to follow. That's not the statutory purpose of these documents. They govern the investigation of allegations of breaches of the code of conduct by councillors. It is not for what Councillor Hyman is seeking to establish common ground around questions that councillors may have about all sorts of things. In this case, about the way in which the council conducts its business in other areas. So I think Robin and I agree it's not appropriate here, but if it's something that Councillor Hyman or any other member or members want to see, then obviously, members of this committee or elsewhere can bring it forward, either by this committee or the appropriate avenue, but it's really not appropriate for these documents. I'm not saying it's inappropriate as a proposal, but it's not the reason that these documents exist, and it really wouldn't be appropriate to have it in those documents. Thank you. Thank you,
Chairman. There's a
very much. Councillor Hyman, I'm going to take the solicitor's advice. So, Councillor Goodrich, you had your hand raised.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've just got to go back to basics. The procedure we have here is to deal with allegations of breach of code of conduct. the code of conduct as we currently have it and the code of conduct that we're going to discuss in the next item does not include in it that if a councillor asks a question and doesn't get the answer that they think is right or that they think is wrong, is not a breach of a code. And that is not a breach of code and therefore wouldn't be covered by these documents. The allegations quite often happen is if somebody asks a question and they get the answer they don't like, and then maybe say more than they should, either to the officer or to other members, then of course it's lack of respect, and then you do breach the code. But we are dealing with breaches of code, and we're not here to, in this item, to rewrite the breaches of code. We all want everything to be honest, truthful, and so on. But having sat as a judge, you get two people, one side and the other, both thinking they're right, and they can't both be. And therefore, there's always an element of interpretation of a fact as to whether it is the way you want it or not. So I think it's just to be very careful that we are just dealing with alleged breaches of code of conduct. And that does not include being dissatisfied with an answer you've had either from a member or from an officer. That isn't included in the code.
All right. Okay, thank you, Councillor Goodridge. Are there any other questions on the document? If not, I shall move to the recommendation. I can't see any hands up, therefore if we move on to the recommendation, please. It is recommended that the Standards Committee consider and debate the proposed changes before agreeing what changes, if any, should be recommended to full council for adoption. And I'd like to add on to that, but before submitting to the full council, the document is passed the independent person and parish clerk for any observations. Can I have a seconder for that? Are we happy with that? Councillor Goodridge, thank you. So can I have a vote on the recommendation then, please? All those in favour?
In favour.
Georgina, are you happy with that?
Are there any votes against or abstentions, Chairman?
Yeah, I'm
can't hear you,
voting against. I'm voting against on the basis that the motion I put has not been heard and is not been allowed to be put forward. I think it's a ridiculous situation, Chairman. I'm going to have to make a complaint, aren't I? How ridiculous is this situation?
Well, Councillor, there wasn't. I don't think there was a seconder who spoke for your
No.
motion.
Georgina, did you count those hands in favour?
There were 9.
Thank you. Those
There were
again?
9.
Thank you. Those again?
1.
And abstention?
None.
In that case, it's carried. Thank you. If we can then move on to item number 7, the LGA new model code of conduct. Robin, did you want to introduce this?
Thank you, Chairman. So item 7, committee members will recall that I said on a number of occasions that once the LGA had published the final version of its new draft model code of conduct, that officers would bring it to this committee for you to consider. So the LGA now have published that final version of the code, and it's included within the papers for you to see. So Waverley Borough Council, like all authorities, including the town and parish councils, are ultimately responsible for agreeing and then abiding by their own code. In practice, this means that Waverley is not compelled to adopt this new code, either in part or in full. As a committee, you could choose to make revisions to our existing code, or you could make amendments to this new proposed LGA model code before recommending it to full council, or indeed you could choose to change nothing at all. However, I do not advise any of those options. The LGA has given significant time, research and effort to developing and widely consulting upon this new code. There has been a debate nationally which I know a number of officers and councillors have been involved in, because some of those consultation events I've been to, I've seen some of you there. So my advice is that we go ahead and adopt this new model code without change. So that would be for this committee to recommend to full council that it adopts the new code as part of the constitution. There's also a recommendation within this report that we set up briefing sessions so that both councillors and staff understand the new code and understand what councillors need to do in order to abide by it. There are a number of changes which I set out and summarise within the report. The biggest change, I think, is around terminology in respect of interests being declared and what actions should be taken accordingly. It doesn't really change the fundamentals of what's done at the moment, but there is a new set of terminology for members to get used to if we adopt this new code. And it will be important that if the council does adopt this new code, that we immediately begin thinking and talking within those terms of interests. I would also write to all town and parish councils, as I always do when there's a change to our own local code, to confirm that Waverley would be adopting this new model code. Those town and parish councils are not compelled to follow suit, but I would expect that many of them would wish to. We do generally have very similar codes of conduct between the towns and parishes and the borough council, and I'm sure that those town and parish councils, like the borough council, may wish to, as I say, rely on the fact that the LGA has done all this work and adopt that code. Thank you, Chairman.
Any questions? I cannot. Councillor Adams.
I'm not sure quite where it is. I was just looking through to see if I could find it again, but I'm sure somewhere it said that the code should be, the suggestion is that the code should be reviewed every year. That seems to me to be a bit unnecessary. Just really a make work activity. So I would suggest that it's not reviewed every year, but perhaps every 4 years.
Robin, is that in the document for 1 year or?
I'd have to go and check. I don't recall that, Chairman, but I personally would think that every 4 years would be too infrequent. I mean, an annual review, I think Fiona's going to answer the question, but I think an annual review would be sensible. And obviously the Standards Committee can choose to review it, more often if it wants to. But I think Fiona is indicating, Chairman.
Yes, Chairman. And Robin, it's the LGA that will carry out an annual review and sort of treat this as an ongoing process and collect feedback as to how it's being received. So they'll carry out an annual review and update if necessary.
Thank you for that. Councillor Hyman.
Well, thank you, Chairman. But perhaps this is the place where we should have ensure that there is a system to ensure that we are acting with honesty. At the top of page 47, the top bullet point, that we are all agreeing that we act with integrity and honesty. If we don't have a system in place to check facts, then of course that's not that's meaningless, isn't it? To agree to be honest when there's no accountability whatsoever. Top of page 51, similarly, under disrepute, it says the final paragraph, sorry, end of the first paragraph of 5.1 on page 51 says, for example, behaviour that is considered dishonest and or deceitful can bring your local authority into disrepute. That applies to everybody, of course. And at the top of page 50, before that, under 3.1, it tells us that that we mustn't try and get other people to change their ways if it would prejudice their professional integrity. Well, of course, the final paragraph of the Nolan Principle says, actually, if people aren't doing things properly, it is our duty as councillors to get them to change their ways. So, we really do have to have a system in place that ensures that we can see who it is that's making the mistake, who it is that is going to have to make the apology or change their ways, rather than have a system which basically bullies people, so that to ensure that they never do have to tell the truth. I mean, we really must have in place a system, a very simple system, where people can get a straight answer. Someone who must be accountable for the response they give, must be questionable, and it has to be the monitoring officer or the chief executive officer, or perhaps possibly the borough solicitor. Obviously, I wouldn't expect them to want to be happy with the idea of more work or be put in an entirely accountable position. But nevertheless, if we're going to make this work, we have to have in there some way of ensuring that we can get a straight answer. So I simply repeat my motion of previously, that we do have to have a system whereby we can get an answer, a straight answer to a question within a reasonable time space and in writing. And if we don't, where do we put that in the system? Where do we put that in the system, Chairman? Or are you just going to make sure we don't go for honesty?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I mean, 2 points I'd like to make. Firstly, I have to go on record to say I can't agree with the idea that there's any discomfort for I or any of my team about being accountable. We're not uncomfortable about being accountable. We're very comfortable being accountable. I don't see, what the actual proposal is, and that leads into my second point. Councillor Hyman, you're talking about a motion, but I'm not clear specifically what change you're saying needs to be made to this document. If there's a specific recommendation as to how this document should be changed before it is put forward for adoption, then of course, under our rules, you can voice that within that committee, see if it's seconded, and I'm sure the chairman will allow debate on that.
Thank you, Robin. Councillor Marriott, you wanted to, that's Peter Marriott.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question on Annex 1, which is disclosable pecuniary interests in item 7. And it talks about beneficial interest in securities of a body and some definitions there. It doesn't include limited liability partnerships. I know this is a question that has been asked in council some time ago in the previous administration. I don't know what the answer is. How do you deal with people with that sort of interest? Because in a partnership, I am a partner, a sleeping partner, basically in a financial institution in the city, but I don't know, who the partners talk to. I don't know, what contracts they have. They do have contracts with major UK financial companies, banks, and so on. But where does my responsibility in disclosing that interest lie? Because it's not specifically covered, as far as I can see.
Thank you, Robin. Did you? Can you clarify that?
I may pick that one up offline, Chairman, unless Daniel has an answer today. But I think that's a point of deal I'm not prepared to answer today. I'd be happy to if I knew the answer, but I think I need to go away and look at it, Chairman.
Daniel, have you an answer, or are you the same?
No, nothing from me, Chairman.
Okay, thank you both. In that case, Councillor Marriott, they will come back to you when an answer is given.
Yes, that's fine.
Councillor John Gray. Councillor Gray.
Oh, thank you, Chairman. Sorry, I missed that. I think that the proposal to accept the new terms of reference from the LGA is a good one, but I'm a bit disappointed in some of the explanations and some of the areas. Maybe it's just me that I'm confused a bit. But on page 58, under land and property, and I think this is page 50, land and property, under disposable pecuniary interests, it's got a very long sentence that says land excludes, and goes right through, including a right to occupy or receive an income. So does that actually refer to your own house? So is your own house not a disposable pecuniary interest? I always thought it had been previously. The second point is, I think it's 721 on page 51, which talks about the use of local authority resources and facilities. And the point B says ensure that such roads are not used for political purpose unless the use could be reasonably regarded as likely to facilitate or be conducive to the discharge of functions of the local authority. And I think that one, there's some areas there which could be open for interpretation and a little bit more explanation of things like, let's say, titles, positions, that sort of things. Would that come under that particular paragraph? As I think there is a crossover between chairman of audit committees, leaders, deputy leaders, etc., who use their positions in communications that could actually be seen as using it for political purposes. So my point is, how good are the explanations, and do they really satisfy us? Or should we ask Robin to do some more work on the explanation, especially around the areas of training, which I know he's going to follow up with that training for members on this. But specifically, the point on page 58 about where does your own property come in? Does it come into that or some other part?
I believe your property does come under that part. Yes.
It does.
Yeah. I mean, Chairman, as a general point, these descriptions, some of these definitions are new, so we'll all have to get used to them, including me and other colleagues will have to get used to them too. I am reticent to start adjusting these very technical parts of the code because work's been put into them by the Local Government Association. But I entirely accept the point that we'll have to be very clear when we all get used to this code, what is included and what isn't. So I'm very happy to commit to supporting members through that process, but I'm less keen on adjusting anything within that table at the moment.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Chairman, Robin, just qualify what I'm saying. I think there are some areas that needs more Q&As when we come round to do training, and I'm happy to input those points at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Now, I'm left only with Councillor Hyman. Now, Councillor Hyman, you wanted to put that motion. Is there anybody who wishes to second Councillor Hyman? And you've heard the advice from both the solicitor and Robin. Can I see a hand for a seconder? No, I'm sorry, Councillor Hyman, there are no
Chairman,
seconders
can
for that
I, I'm wondering whether I was asked if I would put that into a clearly stated paragraph that I'd want inserted. In which case, because I'd said that the party should have the right to obtain a clear answer to a question in writing in good time, and that obviously would, in order to ensure that that it's fair, it would have to be the monitoring officer, complainant, and complainee, the person with the allegation. What do we call the person with the allegation against them? Have we got a short word for it?
Complainant.
No, that's the person making the complaint.
Subject member is the person being complained about.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so if it's a complaint by a member of the public, I suppose we need to, we wouldn't necessarily want to be able to ask questions of those directly. So the monitoring officer should be able to. So the subject member and monitoring officer have the right to obtain a clear answer to a relevant question in writing in good time to establish the facts of the matter. So just to ensure we don't waste people's time without the facts, and that we insert a paragraph, reword it as you want, but that's what it would need to be saying, that the monitoring officer can question the complainant. Obviously, the subject member would not expect to be able to.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. You're repeating yourself. We've got that. Robin, is there anything you would look at that or not?
Just look to see whether it's seconded within the committee.
Daniel, have you anything to say on that?
No.
Councillor Hyman.
Just
Sorry,
briefly,
it's Councillor Hughes. Could I just make a comment? Just a very brief one, please. Within the LLG code, it's very clear, and it does go through most of the Nolan principles, but around some of the Nolan principles, it's not very clear, like leadership and honesty, actually. So maybe it's the training issue that also needs to be addressed to make sure that each of the Nolan principles are clearly addressed during the training of new councillors, to make sure that they fully have a good example against each of the Nolan principles of what that means in a practical way. Okay, that's my point, that there does seem to be a few gaps in some of the examples versus the Nolan principles within the LLG document.
Thank you, Councillor Hughes. I've got no more hands. Now, Councillor Hyman, your motion was not supported, as you know. The officers will take
I'm hardly surprised, but establishing the truth is not particularly popular. But if I can take you to issues with this document, particularly.
Point of order, I'd ask Councillor Hyman to apologise for that. He can't say that on behalf of everybody who's a member. That's just unacceptable. I'm sorry.
Councillor Hyman, will you
We'll let the public decide for themselves. Page 60, Chairman, if I may. Page 60. Halfway down, we've got best practice. I'm assuming that this is going to be something which will be adopted by us as part of our code of conduct.
Can I please, sorry to involve myself, can I please ask all members of the committee to make sure that if the chairman is speaking, you allow the chairman to finish?
Thank you, Robin. Right, Councillor Hyman, can you please keep it brief? We're spending a lot of time here where you're going around in circles, so please make this new point briefly.
I apologise that I was at one point unable to hear all of what Councillor Peter Marriott said earlier in this respect, and therefore I would, if I'm repeating what he said, I don't know what it was he said, so I don't know. Best practice 1 here says that we should include prohibitions on bullying and harassment in codes of conduct. They should have a definition of bullying and harassment and a list of examples. I just wondered whether we have that in here, because I haven't seen it. Under best practice 3, it says we should review the code of conduct, or it says principal authorities, which I think is probably us, because I think the parish councils and town councils are considered to be the unprincipled, the lower ones, not unprincipled, should review their code of conduct each year. And people were saying earlier they hadn't read the papers, obviously, and seek where possible the views of the public, community organisations and neighbouring authorities. And I was wondering if you could please tell me, Chairman, where we have obtained the views of the public, community organisations and neighbouring authorities on all of these changes being made today. And under best practice 6, council should publish a clear and straightforward public interest test against which allegations are filtered. And I was wondering where the public might be able to find that, so that's clear to them. And under best practice 8, where it says an independent person should be consulted as to whether to undertake a formal investigation on an allegation and should be given the option to review and comment on allegations, blah, blah, blah. And I think that members who didn't want to go through the previous document have just agreed to the opposite to that. So we shouldn't be agreeing 2 things in the same day within 10 minutes, which are the opposite. If you turn to page 20, I think, is it? It was about, it's the bit that talks about what the monitoring officer, what the independent person does and doesn't do. And it had said that the monitoring officer does not have to take into account what the independent person said at the first stage. I'm pretty sure that's what it said. And this is saying the opposite. The monitoring officer might want to comment on that whilst I try and find the paragraph in the original thing that that said what I'm trying to tell you.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Robin or Daniel, is there anything you want to comment on what Councillor Hyman is saying?
I'll just pick up on the points about bullying and harassment. So yes, it's set out in the covering report that the new code does include a specific reference to bullying and harassment.
Thank you. Have you now finished, Councillor Hyman?
I'm sorry, I wanted to know, have we got the list of examples and whatever, or is it just you're saying there's a reference to this saying what I've just said? I didn't understand the response. Is there a page number here that you could give me where I can see that list? And similarly, the other issues, the public interest test, best practice 6, and also the other issue. There is over the page some other issues. Best practice 13, we should have procedures in place to address any conflicts of interest, and we should therefore have procedures which explain which alternative authority we're going to go to where the monitoring officer may or officers may have a vested interest that precludes them from making the investigations or overseeing the investigations themselves. So that's number 13, and I'll leave it at that because that's probably enough for now. But I would like those particularly referencing, and I'd like the page numbers rather than just telling, oh, it's somewhere here, if you don't mind.
So the book, thank you. So through you, Chairman, the bullying, harassment and discrimination reference that I made before can be found on page 49 of your agenda pack. I'm afraid that beyond that, I've slightly lost track of what the question is. So I'm happy to take them one by one, Chairman, but I'll leave that with you.
Councillor Hyman, did you want any more answers, or can we get Robin to answer you at a later time?
If it's got answers now, then I'd like them now. If not, then at a later time would be good. Thank you.
If you would like to ask those questions at a later time, then Councillor Hyman, I'm sure Robin will.
If I can ask, Chairman, if Councillor Hyman puts the questions to me by email in writing so that I can be clear what they are. Thank you.
Exactly. Then he'll come back to you, Councillor Hyman. I see no other hands up. So if there are no other questions, then let's go on to the recommendation, please. The recommendation is that it's recommended full council a new LGA model code be adopted without any local amendments, and ask the monitoring officer to arrange council briefings on the new model code once it has been adopted. All those in favour of that? Georgina, have you managed to count?
Sorry, I was muted. 7.
Those against? And
There's
any
none
abstentions?
against.
Thank you. Any abstentions?
2.
Thank you. Then that is passed. Thank you very much. A lively debate. So we now go on to item 8, which is the constitutional matter, amendments to the Waverley Constitution, scheme of delegation, and the virtual meeting procedure rules. Once again, Robin, did you want to introduce this?
Thank you, Chairman. Item 8's a 2 for 1, so you'd be pleased to hear that. One matter relating to the scheme of delegation, and one matter relating to our virtual procedure meeting rules.
I was advised I will not be able to vote on this. It's Councillor Hughes, so I was going to sign off. Is that satisfactory, Chairman?
That's fine. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'll briefly introduce both items. The first is a return to an item previously discussed by the committee in October last year, where you were looking at whether or not the committee should recommend to full council that the scheme of delegation be amended to include a new proviso that once a decision has been made by a committee, then any future decisions relating to that same matter must also be decided by the committee rather than by virtue of the scheme of delegation. At the October meeting, the committee asked for further thought to be given to the wording. And if you look at paragraph 4.3, that contains the text previously brought to the committee, but with the addition of some new text, which is highlighted yellow, which came forward from the Vice Chair. So it's before you now for discussion. This isn't necessarily a straightforward issue. You have options. You have the option of going with the wording here, of doing nothing or making some other suggestion. You are absolutely within your rights as a committee to put forward this suggestion to full council. On balance, I remain of the opinion this is not a decision that you need to make. And I have included at paragraph 4.4 That's the first paragraph, 4.4. Apologies that there's two of those. That's the same wording from the previous report, which sets out some of the issues that you ought to consider, I think, as a committee before deciding to put forward this recommendation to full council. So the second item is a proposed new virtual procedure meeting rule relating to the use of the chat function within Zoom. The new rule, it's proposed, will apply to formal committee meetings like this one, rather than informal working group meetings or discussions or briefing meetings for members. And the proposal that we're putting forward is that there be a new virtual procedure meeting rule, which asks members not to use the chat function for most matters, only for bits of technical advice, etc. The argument for introducing this new rule is that the use of the chat function to do anything other than ask for technical support or give very basic messages is very untransparent from a public perspective and arguably not very democratic. As you know, members of the public have a right to hear the debate of their local council, and they won't hear all elements of the debate if some elements of that debate are being held via the chat function. Equally, because of the technology and also people working at different pace and with different areas of focus in a meeting, not all members or indeed officers will always be able to access what's going on in the chat stream within Zoom. And so they also may not be keeping track of elements of the debate, which some members may be putting into the chat function. So the proposal is that we introduce this new rule, which gives members clear guidance on when they shouldn't use the chat function. There are two alternatives to that. The one is that you leave things as they are. The second is that you simply turn the chat function off. But the reason we haven't put that in is I think there's no reason why members shouldn't be able to use it for what would be useful to all of us, which, as I say, is just to ask for technical advice. For example, a member may want to say, I can't find my mute button, but I do want to speak, that sort of thing. But it's ultimately for you to discuss as a committee. So thank you very much, Chairman. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Robin. So let's start with the first one, obviously. Have I any questions on the first? All follows. It
Thank you, Chair. It's not so much a question as it is just a very quick, I suppose it is a question through you, if possible. Would Councillor Goodridge, the Vice Chair who submitted those words, would he introduce as to why he thinks that makes it better? I mean, from my point of view on first reading, I don't think that this is actually necessary as an entity and is likely to cause all sorts of problems and confusion. So, I mean, I'll obviously wait to hear from other members, but at the moment I'm minded to oppose it again. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Adams.
We're talking about the committee receiving back the question again, if it's, is that the one we're talking about?
Yes, it is the first part.
Okay. Well, I just added down in the last line, I thought that you could put a future decision, because I can't, once you've decided that it's got to come back to committee, if then you decide that actually the officer could make the decision on a particular point that has arisen there, then that would be fine. But not then any subsequent factors that arose. If a debate rose with the officer and whoever was otherwise looking at the issue, so that, in other words, multiple activities occurring after that first one should come back to committee, not just have the first one they've agreed to put it through committee. But if a different issue arises on the same point, then it should come back to the committee. So I've just inserted the letter, the A, before future in the second to last line.
And Councillor Adams, Councillor Goodridge.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, this arose out of a problem that we had in the Godalming area, where the executive made a decision and then an officer at a later date made a different decision. And
Sorry, point of order, that's factually untrue. The officer merely followed through the decision that was made by the first executive. They did not make a different decision, Councillor Goodrich.
Well,
and that was sustained by an ONS and officers' reports.
Well, I slightly beg to differ, but the fact of the matter is there was, and it was accepted by the chief executive, that there was ambiguity as to the situation. And therefore, this clause has been suggested on the basis to remove any ambiguity. And in a way to protect officers from having to take responsibility. And therefore, it is far better, it seems to me, that when you are dealing with a matter which has been decided by a committee, whether it be the executive or some other committee, and then a further decision has to be taken about the same matter, that the original committee is seized with the matter and can deal with it. It just seems a sensible arrangement. And I put in the last words in there on the basis that the committee, when it makes the original decision, can make it clear that you get on with it, we don't want it back. So that I'm not trying to sort of burden the administration or bureaucracy unnecessarily, but to try and ensure that we don't have ambiguity, and this would remove the ambiguity on a situation that has arisen where a lot of disquiet was felt by a number of councillors. And I think it's worth putting in so that future problems will be avoided by the clarity, and that's the purpose of it. So far as you don't want to talk about the other one.
Councillor John Gray.
Sorry, has Councillor Goodrich finished? Or are you?
Sorry, I thought, yeah.
All right. Okay. My point on this is that without the last bit, I have some difficulty with it. I think the last bit makes it very clear that whoever the committee is in control of how they wish to do business. There was an instance came up a couple of years ago to do with planning. And it's not quite in the same thing, but it's a good illustration of where a particular planning went to joint planning committee because it was over a certain number, and then subsequently an application come in for an extension which was below the number, and it was potentially going to the wrong committee. It wasn't going back to the first committee. And I think that's an example that you've got of something that can go wrong if you're not careful. And I do think that in this case, decisions that go to a particular committee should be within that remit, unless they've got an action plan which says this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and I delegate it to officers. I find it a good governance, a general comment in there, and I don't think it's one that we should be particularly frightened of. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Peter Marriott.
Thank you, Chair. I think I understand that section 4.3. I thought there was a sort of tautology. I think Councillor Goodrich has explained it, but you know, where we say all future decisions must be taken by committee, then 2 lines down saying unless the committee says otherwise. It just seems to be a bit clumsily worded, perhaps. In other words, the committee has a decision regardless. All future decisions don't really relate to this. I think meaning of this section. Just my reading of the wording.
Do you want me to try and explain that, Chairman?
Yes, please, Robin.
The reason the extra wording has gone in is that one of the items discussed last time round was whether or not you would always want matters once a committee has, seized a matter, which I think was Councillor Goodrich's terminology. Once a committee has seized a matter, there may be situations where there's no need and the committee doesn't want to have all decisions coming back to it. So the yellow highlighted text aims to give you a get out to what is otherwise a universal principle. So the universal principle is once a committee has been involved in a decision making on a matter, then it is involved in all decisions on that matter. But it has the choice to if you like, not take up that not take up that power and give it back to the officers to do under their scheme of delegation. The way things are at the moment is that each decision is looked at separately. So a committee may take on a particular decision around a matter, but then an officer can separately, because the scheme of delegation allows them to, can separately make their own decision on a different matter, I would say, but that's a separate debate, I think. So that's the intention here. That's what the yellow text wording was intending to clarify.
Okay. Can I ask maybe an associated question with this? It's just a question of the procedure. I mean, I've not had much experience of these sorts of issues, but in general, is it the case that the officers can, what do we say here, officers refer to a particular matter, etc., etc. Do officers make decisions or look for things to be done without going through the executive? Is that the general rule? I mean, if somebody comes to the monitoring officer, Robin, with a problem, do you take that on board yourself to act on, or do you talk to the executive before going down a particular route?
No, the point here, Chair, if I may, the point here is that there's a scheme of delegation which sets out specific powers which have been delegated to specific officers. And the way that our scheme works is that there are many general statements with some exceptions to those general statements, but nonetheless, it's a specific scheme giving officers the power to make decisions on behalf of councillors. So they don't have to come through me. They may come through me or my team for guidance about how to interpret the scheme of delegation. But the scheme of delegation is agreed by councillors. So once it's in place, officers can use their own authority that are given to them within it.
Thank you, Robin. Can I now go to Councillor Follows?
Thank you. And actually, the debate really highlights exactly what I expected. So if we go back to the origin of this coming to council in the first place, I would first off submit that I don't agree with Councillor Goodridge's interpretation that it was ambiguous. I don't think it was at all. Secondly, this solution wouldn't have actually corrected the problem that Councillor Goodridge has raised it to correct. So that decision regarding the matter in Godalming, the decision of the previous administration's executive was to kick off a process. It wasn't to decide to renew a lease or not. It was to kick off a process of evaluation. Now, when that evaluation failed, the decision was that effectively it failed, which means there was no further process. It didn't meet those legal criteria to go forward. So the officers didn't make an extra decision to overturn the executive of the day. They merely followed through the decision of the executive, which had two outcomes, pass or fail, and it failed. So that's what happened. Now, what Councillor Goodridge is proposing here wouldn't have changed that, because there was no additional decision. It was just one that followed through to one of the two possible outcomes. So this wouldn't have fixed that. What I would suggest is, and this is really where I need to ask Robin for clarity, any individual committee that chose upon a particular individual decision to restrict delegation could do so under its own authority, is what I'm really asking here. I think the consequences from blanketly doing this to all decisions, I think, is going to cause lots of extra work, but I don't think it restricts an individual's committee to, on a case-by-case basis, restrict that delegation and ask it to come back in any individual decision, which I think would be the far more practical way of doing this and allow committees the freedom to choose when it's important to them or not. But I do think this notion that what Councillor Goodridge is proposing would have corrected even the thing he's suggesting it for, it wouldn't. It was one decision that was followed through to one of its two possible outcomes. So if for some reason this passes standards, I will be vigorously opposing it at full council for the same reasons. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Councillor Hyman.
Yes, I think I can see the point that that Councillor Goodridge is making, and I see the Councillor Follows quite reasonable position on it. But I suppose it's a question then of what we could do is decide that in future, where we've got a decision where we are authorising something, which is what the executive of the council did a few years ago, in the issue in question, and we put into the recommendation that if the issues to which this is subject, the conditions of the attached to the decision, effectively, if those conditions are not met, then it must come back, or councillors must be told, members must be informed in good time or something. How are we going to do that? And I in many ways agree with Councillor Goodridge, but that said, if we apply this, how's it going to work to planning decisions then? If there's a call in, or if there's a officer or member interest, and that's why something has been called into committee, or if it's EIA application or whatever, that everything then from, according to this recommendation, the way I read it, the wording of it, all discharge of conditions would have to come back to the council. Every little decision that is made on that, particularly in EIA or habitats issues, everything would have to come back in front of that committee. And so I think we need to be a little bit careful about our wording and how we limit it or restrict it. I must admit, like with the constitution issue earlier, I very much like to have in front of me a copy of the document which is being changed and what the actual changes to that document are, and without having the relevant section of the scheme of delegation in front of me, I find that a little difficult. Chairman, if I'm just wondering, I'm thinking this is going to go in front of council, and it might go in front of council in 3 weeks' time. So on page 69 in the first bit, that's paragraph 1.1 there. So under purpose and summary, paragraph 1 is it's a large paragraph. I've got another 1 underneath 2 and 3, but I'm not so much worried about that. When I get down to on page 71, immediately above where it says virtual meeting procedure rules, so the very last words of this is, one of our options now is to decide to add a catch-all statement to the start of the scheme of the type listed in paragraph 1.1 little 1 or I above. And I want to know where I can find, are we referring to the bit at the beginning, or shall I just cross the I out? And is that a catch-all that we're referring to, the paragraph 1.1? If it's going in front of council, can we put something after 4.1 that starts with like A instead of just number and with a little letter at the beginning? Under 4.4, yeah, let's update the paragraphing if we can as well, please. Under 4.4, the third arrow there, pretty arrow, third but last word there, that's probably rubber stamping, I would imagine. And if we can sort that out there as well. Chairman, are you going to do the virtual meeting procedure rule separately? Because that's all I want to say.
So I'd rather keep it separate. I'd rather keep this separate at the moment. We're doing number 1 at the moment. Robin,
thanks very much. So yeah, how does this apply to planning is the real issue, and other than that, can we just somebody make a note of the typos if it's going to council?
We've got that. Robin or Daniel, can you come back on those?
Chairman, I'll come back on those. So so thank you, Councillor Hyman, you're correct. That 1.1 little 1, that's a hangover from the fact that I copied the text across from the previous report. So, you know, what that's doing is referring you back to the proposed text, which in this report is at paragraph 4.3. So yes, indeed, that's incorrect. And yes, staining is stamping, so that's good. So well done for spotting that. I mean, I guess the question around how this would apply to planning is a good one, because the point that we're making here is that if this goes in, it will be a blanket provision across the whole of the scheme delegation. So it would apply to planning as well.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Goodridge, you wanted to come back.
Thank you, Chairman, for allowing me to come back. Two points. Firstly, relating to Councillor Follow's view on the matter. My understanding of, or interpretation of the facts, if you like, it was that the executive several years ago on the particular matter we were talking about agreed to grant a lease. All the terms were agreed, and it was agreed subject to legal process. In other words, the legal side would be sorted out so that the lease would be drawn up and so on and so forth. The tenant and the tenant still wanted to carry on. There was no change of those terms from his point of view. But despite that, officers decided that the lease would not be granted and possession would be obtained of the property. I consider that a reverse of certainly the spirit, if not the letter, of the first decision. But that's my interpretation. The second point about planning is that I think if you are grant planning subject to conditions and whatever, I would certainly not expect that to come back. And if there needs to be some adjustment of wording, but planning is important because for the bit that Councillor Gray mentioned, the scheme of delegation could not happen on a certain planning application, I think in Ewhurst. I think it was Ewhurst. And then they came back with a small application to make it a bit bigger than the one that main planning had decided. And that had to come back. And it was agreed that was a decision that main planning had taken, and therefore a new planning application which changed the situation needed to come back to main planning rather than being delegated to a local committee, which it was only a few extra houses, but it related to the first decision that had been taken. So I think that was a good example, in fact, of in support of what is being proposed. So I mean, it's a matter for the committee to decide, but I think this would be beneficial for clarity for councils for years to come. Hence, I'm putting it forward.
Goodrich. Sorry. Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. Fiona, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just wanted to say that point about the planning issue is already covered off within the scheme of delegation to the head of planning as an exception to that, so that I've forgotten what the actual wording is, but where a scheme has previously been to a planning committee and an amendment to a sub part of a bigger scheme is submitted, then it has to go back to the committee. So that is actually already covered off as an exception to the scheme, the head of planning scheme of delegation.
Thanks for the clarification. Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just going to Fiona's point. The change in wording came as a result after we had the issue, and the delegation was specifically changed. I think that I'd perhaps confused it a bit by saying we're planning, but the general principle really should be there on all decisions. And I would ask members of this committee, having spent 4 or 5 years on audit, is to say, look at this from a governance point of view. What's it actually saying to us? It's saying to us, let's have consistency of decision making. And it's not restricting people to decide that subsequently, having made a decision, we can put this out in 5 steps and we will delegate those 5 steps to it. It basically is saying to an executive or another committee that they should think through what they are agreeing on and how it's subsequently going to be followed up. And I certainly wouldn't see it as I hope we don't see it as a political issue. It's one of governance. What is there in there that basically you object to? I know that the question comes up a number of times as saying, well, we don't need to change it. I would say that I think we do need to change it because we need to be very clear what the rules are. And this basically gives us a clear definition of what the rule is and a clear definition of the option of the person making the decision to format how it's subsequently going to be controlled. Thank you for letting me come back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Craig. Councillor Follows, do you want to come back?
Yeah, sorry, thank you, Chair. And actually, I again disagree with that. I mean, if a committee, any committee, and particularly executive, aren't understanding the decision that they're making, they should not be making it. Now, I think the question I've got to ask Robin, just to clarify absolutely here, is does a committee have the power to, on a case-by-case basis, disregard the taking this from effectively the reverse of what this says, is there already an existing power for a committee to say, no, I want the delegation of authority suspended and I want this to come back to committee? Can they do that on a case-by-case basis at present? And if I may come back after the answer of that, Chair.
So, Chairman, not disregarding a decision that's being made, but I think what you're saying is, can the scheme be disregarded?
Yeah,
so
sorry.
As a general, no, I just wanted to clarify. So, as a general principle, an officer which has power given to him or her under the scheme can choose to not use that power and put the decision back into a committee. And equally, a committee can say, actually, we would like to make that decision on this occasion. What is needed clearly is communication in advance of either making the decision. So that's the long answer. The short answer is yes, there's already the ability to do that, Councillor Follows, within the arrangements that we have in place.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, sorry, I apologise. If I may then, Chair. Yeah, so then my original point stands. I won't be supporting this because, firstly, if a committee isn't reading its decisions, it is in a different place, and no amount of changes to the Constitution will make that decision making better if they don't read and understand what they're deciding. And secondly, as they already have the power to, on an individual basis, restrict the delegation of authority so it does come back to a committee, I would suggest that the committee and its chair are, on a case-by-case basis, best placed to make that call and have the power already to make it if they so choose. And as far as I'm concerned, bringing on extra rules, especially when we can't map out the full consequences of those rules, is actually quite dangerous. So I'm content that things are robust as they are. Committees can do what they need to if they have to. And again, it goes back to councillors reading the papers and understanding the decisions. And that's just nothing you can do will make that any better. I again support this. I again reject the need for this completely.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Councillor Hyman.
Sorry, I'd left my hand up because I was going to speak on the virtual meeting procedure rules, not on this.
Okay,
thank you.
Okay. As there are no more hands up, unless anybody wants to say anything. No, I can't see anything. What I'll do, I think, if we can take the vote first of all on this, then we can discuss the other one, the virtual. So we know what the recommendation is. Item 1, which is considered whether to recommend the council to limit the scope of the scheme of delegation to officers once the matter has been brought to committee in order for committee to retain ownership of the issue by insertion of the following wording. I think we've all read that wording. I wasn't going to propose to actually read it out unless you want me to. No, fine. Then in that case, can we take a vote on this part of the recommendation only, please? All those for?
Four councillors.
Thank you. Those against?
Four councillors.
And those abstaining?
One councillor.
Okay, now, as chairman, obviously I have the right to cast a vote. Therefore, the motion is lost. I will continue with my original vote as fairness. So that motion recommendation is lost. Thank you. Now, if we go on to Robin, do we need to recommend and say it is and vote for that, or can we now leave that?
I think that was clear, Chairman. You referred to the text, and I think that was a clear vote. But if any member feels it wasn't, then please say.
Thank you very much. So we'll go on to number 2 then. When I can find it on my bit of paper. Right, it's consider whether to recommend to council the adoption of virtual meeting procedure rule 9. You heard Robin introduce it. Now, are there any questions? I've got one first of all from Councillor Follows.
No, just to say, I think this is a very sensible evolution as we've all learned how to use this a bit better. I've been as guilty as anybody of using that chat I think it's a sensible restriction. I think we had a few options presented, and the one I would go with was not disable the chat completely, allow it to be used for operational problems being reported, but restrict it for all the reasons that the officers had said. That would be my suggestion, and otherwise I think it's a very sensible suggestion.
Thank you, Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think this is vital, but I was going to raise other issues because at 4.5, I think there's a misprint. It says Waverley has successfully. Surely they mean unsuccessfully held council meetings virtually. To see members in a state of undress, sitting in front of unmade beds, with dogs running about on their legs or children of officers on their knee during meetings really brings this council into disrepute. That is not the standard we should expect. Like Speaker Hoyle doesn't allow sloppiness on remote, neither should we on this council. And the number of people who are muted, or we can't get certain things like YouTube to run that causes long delays and meetings taking 3 times as long as they would if we were really there. So this is vital, but also I think we need, as the Standards Committee, to point out standards don't drop just because this is a Zoom meeting. You should behave as if you were in the chamber. And to see officers playing away on their phones during council meetings, which we do, from the very top downwards, is also unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Knowles. I've now got Councillor Hyman.
So that's very easy for me to echo exactly what Councillor Knowles has just said. If we can run through this from the very beginning, though, we're being asked here to effectively authorise this document that's from page 75 to 79 with a change made to it, the change which has been put to us I'm perfectly happy with. I agree absolutely. I think it should extend to informal briefings and whatever, because there are a lot of councillors who seem to spend a lot more time chatting to each other on the chat function during briefings than actually paying attention to what they're being told. And I really don't think that that's appropriate, even though it's not in the public domain. And of course, it's not possible to resolve those issues properly in that way anyway. So, but if we can start at the top of page 75, which is what's being put in front of us, VMPR1, I'm really a little bit uncomfortable agreeing to leave that there if we're making changes, because it's gone. It's history, as far as I'm concerned. It may be that we would need to update it. The government's yet to pass the laws to extend things, as far as I understand. So I don't know where we really stand with VMPR1. But if officers would confirm whether it's appropriate to leave that in there, as though we've just agreed we're going to do something a year ago, which is a bit odd. I think if we go to VMPR4, I've made a few notes on this one. I have a difficulty also with meetings where members have their video switched off all the time. It is not possible to tell whether a member's actually there. Where it's to hear and where practicably see, or where practicable see, and be so heard, and where practical be seen. I understand the law, you don't have to be seen, but you know, it is very easy for any member to get another member of their family, I'm sure, to turn their thing on whilst they disappear off somewhere, log in, they've got a login code, leave it with muted and the camera off, and then disappear, you know, half an hour before the end, just turn it off or whatever. And we've no idea whether people are actually in that meeting or not. So as I say, it's impossible to ascertain whether a member is or is not present unless at most points in that meeting they have their camera on. I can understand people with broadband bandwidth issues or whatever. If you're working on your iPad, you haven't got it plugged into the router, so you're not getting the full signal necessarily. Like on my iPad, I have problems when I don't have any problem on my computer. But so yes, if people are speaking, they should be able to possibly turn the video off whilst they're speaking. They're obviously there at the time, if that helps. because how can we know whether we're chorus or not if we don't know whether people are actually there or not? In ONS meetings, particularly, people can turn up and not, but not be there. Could be off somewhere else. So I have difficulty with that, and I think we should have a requirement that members of the committee have their their video on, unless they're speaking and it's necessary to turn it off to aid the clarity of the speech. That members who are not members of the committee have their video off, and that they don't have distracting backgrounds as well. No background at all is much better than any of these, half the things that we see from people. That's in our, we've got some sort of procedures somewhere that say that, but nobody takes any notice. We also want people to dress as though they're in a meeting, if they would. But there's another issue when we go to VMPR 6, with remote voting. I have issues here with our planning meetings where a number of members of the committee say that, oh, I've missed this bit, I've missed that bit, but they're still allowed to vote. That mustn't be allowed according to these rules. So can we have clarification, please? Are we going to apply these rules and prevent people from voting if they haven't been able to see? How can we be sure whether they've been able to hear and see everything? We know people, some members are honest enough to tell us they missed a load of that bit. But then the chairman never seems to say, well, we're not going to let you vote on it. And the other issue on VMPR 7, members excluded from the meeting, at the bottom of page 77, Chairman, and thank you for indulging me here. It says where a member is required to leave the meeting, the means of remote attendance and access is to be severed. Well, they can just watch on the webcast. I have difficulty with understanding. We've got these rules which in some ways actually are pointless. At 8.2, where members are meant to be honest in terms of whether whether someone else is in the room that can't be seen, that shouldn't be watching an exempt bit or whatever. How can we know? As Councillor Knoll said, we've had kids, dogs, God knows everything else, and that really shows the system isn't working. We need to have some system of accountability. I don't know how we do it, but if it's not, why have a rule? There are issues also with the new etiquette with VMPR 9. It's where we've got how do you raise a point of order properly? Should we use chats to raise a point of order if the chairman's not noticing a hand up or whatever? Because in most cases, a point of order or a point of personal explanation, if you're in the chamber, you'd stand up and you'd say it, and then the chairman would, in due course, either immediately or after the other person's finished, would allow you to speak and make your point of order or point of personal explanation. And I don't know how, we can't do that in this system. I agree with Councillor Knowles. I do not like these Zoom meetings. People misunderstand too much, and it's just not a good way of making decisions. But I think we should add to this certainly some sort of requirements that people are conducting themselves in the manner that Councillor Knowles has so eloquently put through. I think we should absolutely make sure that people have their video on if they are in a meeting, and switched off if they are not a member of that committee, unless they've registered and they are then speaking. Thank you very much for indulging me, Chairman. I don't know whether you want me to put any of those things forward, as whether Councillor Knowles would like to come back and put things forward as a recommendation to add in the etiquette. I'd be happy if he did. Thanks.
Simon, I think one of the problems we have is, of course, that it's almost impossible to police. We don't know. It is an honesty trust thing. And unfortunately, there's no way of knowing if somebody's at the end of the line or not. I take your point, but I'm not quite sure how we would actually prove anything, or indeed how we proceed with that side of things. If I can take the next one, which is Councillor Follows. Sorry, Councillor Gray, you were first.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just a quick one on the chat function. We, when it was first brought in with Zoom, we could actually chat privately with individual members. That was then subsequently stopped, and you could only communicate generally effectively with Waverley Democratic Services, and I think that has worked quite well over the time. And I wouldn't like to see us dropping the chat function because it's very useful. And we have used it in some cases to vote because other means has failed. So I certainly support continuing with the limited chat function that we've got now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Chair. So I mean, I think I've been morally obligated to respond, particularly to Councillor Knowles, but also to Councillor Hyman. And if we're being nitpicky, Councillor Knowles, I can't see your whole face, and you've not got a Waverley background on, and we could go into these sorts of things. But I would remind you that in a pandemic, we're forcing our officers to dial in from Zoom, often not from the comfort of a nice big study or room they've got set aside for this, but often in bedrooms and kitchen tables and other things where, you know, not crazy in a lockdown that somebody's child or dog or other thing may interfere in our meeting. And I think really we just have to have a bit of a reality check about, you know, where we are and why we're doing this. And I think to be upset with officers because of things like their children possibly walking into a meeting when we're forcing them to do it from home in spaces that were probably not meant for it. And let's just assume that they're the only member of their family having to work from home as well, because usually they're not. I just think that's just not only unrealistic, but actually deeply just not warranted to say to officers. I think it's just out of order, frankly. I think restricting the chat is fine, but I think we just have to be a bit realistic about these things in a pandemic. In terms of the video, there will be plenty of times where bandwidth in parts of Waverley isn't amazing, and so people turning their videos off is sometimes required. And I think on the other point regarding voting, unless we take a stance where we are believing all Waverley councillors by default are trying to defraud and to be dishonest as a standard line, I think we have to rely on trust unless somebody reports an issue. So I would ask Councillor Knowles actually to apologise to officers for a comment that I think might be taken quite seriously by some. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Can I also correct something, Councillor Hyman? That is, you said about voters not being allowed when they disappear. About a fortnight ago, I was chairing a meeting as mayor down at Hazlemere. My bandwidth went. Unfortunately, I got kicked out of the meeting by it. I was out for about 6 or 7 minutes. When I came back, I'd missed the debate or a lot of that debate, and I myself disqualified myself from either taking any further part in that or voting. So yes, we will do it. It is honesty, and because I was seen not to be there, I did not vote. Thank you. I've now got the 3 officers that all wanted to make a comment. So if I start with Fiona.
Thank you, Chairman. Just going through some of the points that Councillor Hyman picked up. The members in remote attendance procedure rule 4, as you've already said, we as officers trust that you're there. If you have bandwidth problems and have to turn off your video, quite often someone will actually put in the chat that that's what they're doing, and they will confirm that they are still there. But we trust you. You've signed up to your code of conduct. Sorry if we're being naive about that, Councillor Hyman, but yes, we trust that you are there and you are participating and listening in the meeting. The remote voting, particularly around planning, I can't remember whether it was the last planning committee or the one before, where there were 2 or 3 members who, I think it was the Eastern Committee, there were two or three members who arrived after the start of the presentation of the first item. I contacted them on the chat and said, as you've arrived late, can I remind you that you are not to vote on this item? You haven't heard all of the presentation. They were fine with that. I kept track of the numbers who were allowed to vote for that particular item. It was all managed behind the scenes. Members excluded from the meeting, that's no different from if they were in the council chamber and they went out to the seats outside the council chamber and then logged into the YouTube feed on their phone. They would be able to see the proceedings. The point is they can't influence them because they're not in the meeting. So that's no different in practice as to how that would operate if a member had an interest that meant that they had to remove themselves from the meeting. I think that was it. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you, Chairman. Just also pick up some points, and Fiona has dealt with one of them. Just a point about the annual meeting. Yes, obviously Waverley's chosen to have its meeting already, but that provision is still there in the regs, and there is a lot of discussion currently about the regs being extended past their current cut-off date. So I suggest that that stays, because it could continue to apply and may apply to the next annual meeting as well. Just a point about having video off. So I can understand the concerns there, and I think that members have already been debating that point about whether members can be seen and whether they're present. Just to remind you about the regulations, and I suppose this underpins the reason for us drafting this new section around etiquette, is the minimum requirement is that the councillors are heard and that the proceedings are heard. There's no obligation for them to be seen, and in fact we could do this by phone if that were possible. There's a big conference call and broadcast that. So and that probably another reason not to penalise members for not having their videos on. A lot of those reasons have already been gone through around bandwidth and other things, but yeah, members' choice to have their video off, just as with staff in meetings as well. Some are not comfortable having their videos on as well. Fiona has picked up the point about members being excluded but still being able to view the meeting. That's absolutely fine. There's a point about people being on phones during meetings. Just from an officer's perspective, we do have to communicate with each other during a meeting. So the officers who are involved in the meeting, just as we would in the council chamber, obviously it's very difficult to do that because we're not sat next to each other anymore. So we do need to communicate. So if you see officers, looking as though they're texting, they probably are, but they're probably texting each other. So it would be very difficult for officers if members were to say that should not happen. And really just to thank Councillor Foley for his comments about children. We don't do it deliberately. We don't invite our children in out of choice. It is an accident on every occasion. And it's a little embarrassing when it happens. So
nor is it a problem, Dan. Sorry, Chair, for intervening, but it is not a problem when that happens.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Councillor Goodrich.
Chairman, just briefly, I mean, a lot of what I was going to say has been covered by officers, so I won't repeat it. But just to remind us that the agenda item here is not to review the whole of the virtual meeting rules, but to consider the extra rule at 9. That's what we're here to discuss, and I think everybody's content with it. I was thinking whether or not we should actually cut the chat out totally, but I think, for technical administration reasons, to leave it still in is a good idea. So I'm happy to go along with it. I mean, I have raised before in planning, when a member turns the video off, is that okay for them still to vote? And the regulations make it very clear that they can, because of the problems with IT and everything else that may happen. So, and quite often officers, quite understandably, with bad IT, give a presentation with their video switched off. And so you can hear them but not see them, and that's fine. So I think let's deal with what's on the agenda, which is item 9, please.
Thank you, Councillor Goodrich. I've got no more hands up, so we'll take the recommendation, please, which is to consider whether to recommend to Council the adoption of virtual meeting procedure rule 9 as set out in Annex 1. All those in favour, please.
Sorry, may I just point out, are we voting on adopting 9.1, 9.2 and 9.3 to the Constitution? That effectively,
as I understand it, yes.
Can we not have an apostrophe after forum then in the forums? Or other forums? Oh, I see. It's a chat or a discussion function of a forum, is it? I don't know. I just don't like a apostrophe there. If we're going through this, I just thought people might want to read it.
Chairman, as I drafted these, I can say that the apostrophe apostrophe's in the right place. I think that probably the comma shouldn't be there, but the apostrophe should be. The comma after forums could come out, but the apostrophe should be there, I think.
Thank you, Daniel. Right, we'll do that again then. All those in favour?
Nine.
All those against?
None.
And abstaining?
None.
Thank you very much. In that case, that motion is passed. Now, item 9 is exclusion of the press and public. There's no reason to do that. So that is the end of the meeting. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, officers. And I will be seeing you at some point. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
Thank you, Chairman.